Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're taking a walk down memory lane with this seemingly boring gray Dell pre-built computer. But to me this computer holds a lot of memories. It was my first real experience with PC gaming and I owe a lot to this computer. It's what got me basically started on any path that I've been on now related to computers. I got this computer back in around 2003, 2004. What happened was my aunt had ordered it from Dell, and because of some shipping mishaps and things like that, she ended up getting 3 of them. And once I saw that she had an extra or 2, I begged her for one. I wanted one so bad because I knew that this was going to be so much better than the E-Machines. Yeah, that E-Machines. The E-Machines computer that we had currently. She was worried about getting charged back from Dell, but didn't want to say anything to Dell, so she just held on to him for like 6 months. But after 6 months, she let me have one, and I took it home, and here it was. So I knew the specs on this computer, and I had been reading Maximum PC magazine as a kid, kind of learning, getting up to speed on specs and things like that, so I knew that this had some sort of gaming capabilities, but I wasn't aware of how good or bad it was going to be. I just knew that it basically had a graphics card, it had a Pentium 4, and to me that was good enough. What graphics card did it have? Well, you know, it's one that's kind of infamous. Geforce 5200, 128 megs. Yeah. I didn't know back then what those were like, but I know now. So that's what I had, and that was my first gaming experience. So all of my early PC gaming was done on this computer. I played everything back then. Half-Life 2, Doom 3, Call of Duty, didn't matter. Whatever it was, I didn't care about the specs. I would just get it and try and play it. And some games ran okay, and some games were terrible, and I couldn't even barely make it through them. Now this computer isn't the exact one I used to have. I've got rid of that a long time ago, but I did pick this one up online because I wanted to, you know, relive that nostalgia and maybe throw some upgrades at it and see what it's like or what it would have been like to upgrade it had I been able to back then. The cool thing about this, it is the exact spec. It's identical to the one I had. It has a 2.6 gigahertz Pentium 4, 512 megabytes of RAM, 40 gigabyte hard drive, and the aforementioned Geforce 5200. When I got the computer, it was actually in pretty good shape overall. I didn't have to really clean it or anything. It ran. When I fired it up, it had Windows installed, and it had all these personal files still. Like, they didn't clear it off or anything, which I thought was interesting. But one thing I did notice is when I tried to throw a game on it and play it to test it out, it ran like crap, like worse than it did back then. Like, it would choke and crash. So I opened it up to investigate it again, and I noticed that the fan shroud was missing. Now, these computers didn't have a fan mounted directly on the heatsink. It just used a big green shroud to direct the air out of the back of the case. And that was gone. I didn't want to try and find one to buy or anything. I was going to make do with what I had on hand, so I decided to take the heatsink out and maybe see if I could mount a fan to it or something. So that's when things kind of started to go downhill. When I went to pull the heatsink out, it didn't just pop right off. It felt like it was stuck, so I tried to like wiggle it out. I tugged on it and it just didn't want to move. I finally gave it a little pull and it came out. And I looked down and there was nothing in the motherboard. So I'm looking around and I'm like confused, and I realized the processor had stuck to the heatsink with the thermal paste. Somehow in doing that, a pin got bent. So now I had to repair the processor before I could do anything with it. After some time with a razor blade and some tweezers, thankfully I was able to get it bent back into place well enough that I could get it socketed back in, and I needed to fire it up and see if it would work. Sure enough, it worked, and I could see it in the BIOS, and I was on my way. Now that I knew I had a working computer again, I had to figure out that heatsink issue, and here was my plan. I was going to take an 80mm fan, get some screws, and just drive it directly into the fins. It had to go on a little crooked because of the spacing, but overall, it works. It seems to keep it cool, and I haven't had any issues with that since. I'm definitely going by, if it looks stupid but works, then it isn't stupid. Now that I have everything working, I needed to put on a fresh install of Windows XP, which went fine. Once that was installed, I threw some games on and it was time to relive those memories. First up, I had to do Half-Life 2. That's the quintessential game to me. That's what got me really into PC gaming, reading about it in the magazines. And back then, when I played this, every maybe 30 seconds or so, the game would stutter. It would almost freeze for a sec and then just pick up and keep going. And I played the entire game like this, dealing with those freezes. The mid-level loading screens could take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. I'm not sure why it took so long. But I fired it up. I was wondering if I was going to get the same experience here, and sure enough, it does lock up the exact same like it did before. It seems to run fine. I even at medium settings, and then it just locks up. And then it'll pick back up and you can play again, and you can get along for a minute or two maybe, and then it locks up. And it kept doing this, and it just really reminded me that I actually played through this entire game with that. Next, I threw Doom 3 at it. I remember picking this up and having no regards for the minimum requirements and just thinking, whatever, I can play it on my computer. And this is pretty much like I remember it looking. Everything's set to low. The character models are terrible. Look, there's no detail in this guy's face. There's no shadows. This is just a bad looking game on low settings. I also decided to see if Crysis could run on it, because why not? And I got an error right when I tried to launch it saying this graphics card wasn't compatible, and I hit OK to run anyway, and it crashed. So no, in its current state, it cannot run Crysis. Painkiller was another game that I had a lot of fun with back then. It ran fine, but I was getting those random freezes here. I don't remember getting them in any other game but Half-Life back in the day, but it was doing it here and kind of made the experience not so great. It would run well and then it would just lock up. So to get some objective numbers, I ran 3D Mark 03 on here. I figured that's the version closest to the time period of this computer, and it might give us some relevant numbers. So it got a score of 990 3D marks. I have no idea if that's good or not. I didn't really compare it to anything online, but it'll give us a good baseline for when I upgrade this, and we can see how much better we do. During the testing, I noticed my little room here started to get a little hot. And man, this thing puts out a lot of heat out of the back. There doesn't seem to be any temperature monitoring with this motherboard. I wasn't able to get any readings off of any programs like Afterburner or Core Temp or anything, so I have no idea what this processor was running at, or the graphics card for that matter. So now that I've thoroughly relived what it was like to game on this computer, let's throw some upgrades at it and see how it can do. Now, obviously some of these parts aren't really what I would have picked back then, especially the graphics card, because what I got didn't really exist back then. I just had to try and find the best AGP card that wasn't priced ridiculously high, because let me tell you, there's some AGP collectors out there or something, and some of the better cards can run upwards of $100, which I wasn't about to pay. So I ended up finding a Radeon X1650 with 512 megabytes of RAM, which is pretty crazy considering, and is way overkill for this computer. There's no way that this is even gonna come close to utilizing that much video memory. Along with that, we are gonna pair it up with a 3.2 gigahertz Pentium 4. That's gonna be up from the 2.6 that's in here. Honestly, I don't 100% know if this is gonna work. So along with that, we're gonna put double the RAM in it and make it 1 gigabyte. So to round it out, we're gonna use something I always wanted to try back in the day, but never had a chance to because SSDs became too common before I ever picked one up. But we're gonna use a 10,000 RPM Raptor hard drive. Due to running the higher speed processor, I wanted to make sure this heatsink had all the chance in the world to keep this thing cool. So what better way to do that than to strap another fan to it? I mean, it worked fine for the first one, so why not double it up? These little 80mm fans are really loud due to being hooked up directly to a 12-volt connector, so I had to add these Noctua low noise adapters to keep it under control. Just take a listen at the difference. It was time to install these upgrades, so I started with the CPU, applying a little Arctic Silver thermal paste, and slapping the heatsink on. Surprisingly, this board has 4 RAM slots, and I just happen to have 2 matching sticks in my stash of RAM. Next, I dropped in the new graphics card into the AGP slot and hooked up the auxiliary power, which uses a 4-pin floppy drive connector. The last upgrade was to drop in the 10,000 RPM Raptor hard drive. Thankfully, this board has a couple of SATA ports I was able to utilize. After all that, I still didn't know if the processor was going to work. Being an OEM computer, I had no idea if the BIOS was going to like this CPU, so after firing it up, thankfully I was able to see it recognized correctly in BIOS. I wasted no time getting back into the testing, and first through 3D Mark 03 at it again. I could immediately tell there was going to be a huge improvement based on the frames in the opening tests. With a score of 7390, that makes this over 700% faster than it was before. Let's see how that translates into actual gameplay. Pulling up Half-Life 2, we can check the video settings and see that it's recommending high for all of the settings here, so let's see how it actually plays. Even though everything's set to high, there's a huge improvement over the previous gameplay. You can see here we're getting around 60 to 70, upwards of 100 sometimes, and this is with all the high settings. If I were to tweak it around a little bit, I'm sure I could get it solid at 60 at least, and probably much higher. And I died there. Another thing to note is the freezing issue that I was experiencing on the previous graphics card is gone. I had 0 freezes in any of the games I tested, so there was definitely something going on with that card that I was not able to figure out. Doom 3 actually auto-detected and recommended ultra quality settings with this setup. I tried that and the frame rate would go around 60 but then would dip into the 30s pretty frequently, so I decided to dial it back to high to see, and it was a much more solid 60 frames a second. And let me tell you, this is a really good looking game considering its age, and it looks completely different from what it was before. I had to try out Crysis again, and this time I was able to launch it, unsurprisingly. The auto detect set it to low settings with 600 by 800 resolution. The frame rate was all over the place in this one, but it was definitely playable, and I was happy to see it running on this computer. So with all these upgrades, this is like a whole completely new machine. But what about that hard drive? It definitely seemed to load things faster. I didn't do any timing to check it, but the one trade-off is this is a loud hard drive. Take a listen. While this computer looks like any old boring Dell pre-built, it truly holds a special place to me. It's what introduced me to PC gaming and PC hardware in general, and put me on a career path involving computers. This computer was an escape from a home life that, simply put, was not good. I was able to get lost in a digital world for a couple of hours at a time and forget about what was going on around me. If I had had internet access back then, I'm sure I would have dove headfirst into something like EverQuest and never looked back. Revisiting this computer brought back a lot of good memories, and not so good memories. But in the end, I came out on the other side okay. And if anyone out there is struggling at home, and you need to hear this, you will too. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.